Hello, this is Alan Hess, author of Googie Modern, Architectural Drawings of R.M.A. Davis and Newlove, and you're listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. I'm Tom Guild. You can have the best architect design your new modernist home, even someone like Bjarke Ingels. But if your builder doesn't know how to handle modernist construction, materials, and details, you are in some deep shit. Joining us today are two masters of the modernist domain, Jake Goldberg, founder and president of Goldberg General Contracting in Chicago, and Kevin Murphy, founder and president of Newphire Building in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Later on, we'll welcome today's musical guest, James Torme. And now, your host and avid Seinfeld fan, George Smart.
Thanks, Tom. Just a little trivia on the catchphrase, master of your domain. The 20th century's greatest TV comedy writing was, for me, the show Seinfeld, and I've been rewatching the series now on Netflix end to end. From the minds of comedians Jerry Seinfeld and Larry David and an unmatched cadre of writers, no show was better at highlighting random experiences from daily life and the odd ways people can judge each other. It won tons of Emmys. Most well-known actresses now in their 50s played Jerry's or George's girlfriend at some point. With 9 seasons and 180 episodes, Seinfeld came to dominate Thursday night TV, back when there were basically only 5 networks, and it ran from 1989 to 1998. The most well-known shows are The Chinese Restaurant, The Soup Nazi, The Parking Garage, and best of all, The Contest, from which the term master of your domain became a catchphrase. I won't give away the plot, but it's a hilarious competition between friends to not do something.
Yes.
The genius of the episode was how they never said one not-for-TV word that starts with an M. Well, today we'll be talking with two masters of a more acceptable M word, modernism. And to wreck another pop culture reference from Field of Dreams, if you come, these guys know how to build it. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs, and by modernist realtor Angela Roll. In a story that we are largely making up, modernist realtor Angela Roll worked her way through college, dancing like no one's watching to Mambo No. 5 and brilliantly house-flipping Neutra, sometimes simultaneously. At 22, following a celebrity-filled party at a famous hillside L.A. modernist house involving diving off the roof into the pool, absolute le monde, and a new use for WD-40, Angela was recruited to the architecture school, where after years of sleep-deprived design studios, she's now a modernist real estate agent with specialized training, advising buyers and sellers on everything from appropriate renovation to saving a completely doomed mid-century house from destruction. That last one is true. Reach her at angelaroll.com. That's R-O-E-H-L or 919-995-0550.
Thank you, George. Chicago native Jake Goldberg always knew he wanted to be a builder. His dad was a student of Mies van der Rohe, and Jake started drawing at his dad's design firm while he was still in high school. In 1987, right after a B.A. in finance and economics, he bravely founded Goldberg General Contracting, one of Chicago's top home builders. The firm has restored homes by Mies van der Rohe, Frank Lloyd Wright, Louis Sullivan, and Howard Van Doren Shaw, and it has built houses for more than a dozen leading modern architects, including John Vinci, Dan Wheeler, Brad Lynch, Celeste Robbins, and Dirk Dennison. Jake also serves on the board of directors for Landmarks Illinois, a nonprofit dedicated to the preservation of Illinois' architectural and historic heritage. Welcome to the show, Jake.
Oh, thanks a lot. I really appreciate being asked to join.
There are a lot of builders, tens of thousands alone in North Carolina. In our revered pantheon of Raleigh-Durham modernist builders, there are few that make it to legendary status with clients. During the 1950s through the 1980s, Frank Walzer was the go-to guy for modernist houses, including Eduardo Catalano's world-famous hyperbolic paraboloid house, sadly destroyed. From the 1980s through the 2010s, Leon Myers was the modernist builder who could build anything that could be drawn and do it right and on time. And today, you'll meet Kevin Murphy of Newphire Building. Clients and architects just go crazy for this guy. For the past 15 years, he has been building custom, ultra-energy efficient houses that, besides being beautiful, regularly produce more energy than they use. Welcome, Kevin.
Thanks for having me, George.
So, Kevin, before we get started on building, you were a teacher and a Peace Corps volunteer for many years. What was that like?
That's right. Well, it was fabulous. My wife and I lived overseas for 9 years teaching, and then coming back to the States, taught for a few years at Chapel Hill Carborough City Schools, and then realized that wasn't what I wanted to do, and wanted to put my skills to better use. And I had grown up working in construction and was fluent in Spanish from my time abroad, and felt like, those two things together, I could find my way in building.
Were you building it all in the Peace Corps or doing something different?
I was an agricultural extensionist and beekeeping, capturing wild hives of bees in the jungle. And
So you were building bee houses or hives.
Yeah, that's right.
And then coming back to the U.S., what did you teach at the high school?
English as a second language at middle school, actually.
Middle school,
Yep.
okay.
Yep. So,
And your wife did the same thing?
Yep. And she continues to teach English as a second language in Chapel Hill.
Now, Jake, when you got started building, I understand you were working out of a light blue Econoline van. Were you living there too, Jake?
Down by the river?
No, this predated the van life craze.
Okay.
Okay.
It was more of a survival and also a college recreation vehicle.
Mm.
But in the early days, when I told my architect dad that I wanted to be a general contractor, he tried to talk me out of it because he said it was too risky. And just from his years of working in Chicago, just knew all the pitfalls and, risks of being a general contractor.
Tell us about your dad.
So my dad was in the Navy, and he had a GI scholarship to go to University of Illinois. And after part of a semester, he felt sort of uninspired by the architecture school there. This is in the early 50s. And he had heard about Mies at IIT, and so he walked away from his scholarship to move to the IIT school. And his first day on the campus, he went into the men's room and was using the urinal next to guess who? Mies, who was next to him with a cigar in his mouth.
Of course.
And at that time, Mies was not teaching undergrads anymore. So my dad kind of missed out on more direct contact with Mies, but occasionally Mies, once in a while would come into the undergraduate studio and pick out a student to sit with, and all the other undergrads would sort of gather around and look over the shoulders. So that, I'm sure, was a great experience for my dad.
And did your dad take on the modernist aesthetic right away?
Oh, yeah. He had the classic international IIT office where he had a model shop, which was traditional and key to that type of office. And it was downtown on Hubbard Street above Andy's Jazz Club. So I got to occasionally spend the day with Dad, go to work with Dad day, and he would take me to the Billy Goat Tavern for hamburgers and
oh, yeah, that's
take me down
from Saturday Night Live. Yeah, Billy Goat Tavern.
Yeah, and it was just a half a block from his office. And then he would take me to the building department, which he was at, almost every day. And back then it was just a big open floor plan where you could just walk from examiner to examiner, whip out your 4 sets of blueprints, and make any of the changes they wanted you to make with a ballpoint pen. And it was a pretty different world than it is today. But it was a cool experience as a kid for me to go through the building department and meet all the examiners that were friendly with my dad.
And you were really into this stuff. Or is this what made you decide you wanted to be a builder?
Well, from the early days of working in my dad's office, I did a lot of tracing because back then, pre-digital era, there was a lot of grunt work to trace drawings for duplication. And I did a lot of that, and I went to a technical high school, Lane Tech in Chicago, where I took a couple years of drafting and some technical classes. But from the early years of just experimenting, working as a carpenter, I was much more inspired to build things than to necessarily design them.
Now, Kevin, you took this turn from teaching English as a second language into building and building modernist kinds of energy-efficient buildings. That's quite a turn. How did you fall into that pool?
Yeah, so I actually, straight out of teaching, worked with Chris Sr. at Anchorage Building, and my focus and Chris's focus were both on energy efficiency and trying to build the most energy efficient building possible given the constraints of the budget and the design. We went from building a lot of craftsman type houses, and then when I started Newphire Building, first house out of the gates was a modern home by Ariel Schechter, and it just got a huge response. It was net zero, modern home, and had that on the Green Builders Home Tour, which the local Home Builders Association has here. And once that was on the tour, it's like everybody wanted one.
Yeah.
And then every year we would have a different one on the Green Builders Home Tour, and it just created a momentum. And we do have an occasional more traditional-looking home come through, but I would say 90% of what we do is modern. And it is, frankly, can be a struggle to meld the aesthetics of modern with an attempt to be energy efficient.
Right, because there's always that trade-off that you have to do.
Mm-hmm.
What year was it that you guys did the zero net energy?
2013. And that one was certified passive house, which is, you're probably aware, Jake. I mean, that's Urbana, Illinois is the home of Passive House Institute US.
Yeah.
But the clients were very focused on energy efficiency and sustainability. And there's a very tiny bubble here, Jake, where, we've got Duke University, UNC Chapel Hill, NC State. There's a fair amount of folks that have the finances and the education to know that it's worthwhile investing a little up front and having, better performance for the life of the home.
Kevin, I want to ask you about one of your early projects.
Mm-hmm.
At age 8, you built a 2-story fort with a rooftop porch. What was that project about? Was that modern or was that something else?
It was pretty cubist. And, I regret to say that products were procured from the local job sites.
Was it structurally sound?
It was. And I guess we got, as it says in my bio, a little too egregious, and the previous owners of the materials came and bulldozed it down. So.
Oh, really? They tore it down?
Yeah, they tore it down.
Oh,
was it on their property or yours? Where did you put it?
It was on, some adjacent property. You didn't want to carry materials that far.
So it wasn't in your backyard.
They revoked your permit.
That's right.
I guess you didn't steal a truck, Kevin, to move the materials.
That is correct, George.
That would have been a lot smarter.
Yeah.
Jake, how did you come into doing modern especially as a builder? Because even in Chicago, where a lot of this is very popular, the dominant style is more traditional.
Yeah, our firm was lucky to be introduced to modernist architects, both for clients and for themselves, and we got a very early exposure to that type of architecture, which has always been our preferred style. And our firm really for years felt like it was a shame that the city that was really the birthplace of modernism was so conservative, because the tendency for a long time has been to fall back on the past and maybe what people's parents and grandparents thought was, the sign of success and permanence, and just a general conservatism of the Midwest, especially on the North Shore, where we do a lot of home building. And we, as a firm, have been kind of frustrated that the modern aesthetic is not more celebrated. But what's been interesting in the last 5 or 10 years, it seems like there's finally a movement to embrace modernism more so than it being just an exception. And for us, it's been great for our company because of our reputation for building modern well, that it's becoming more popular. And I find it interesting, this sort of similarity between the turn of the century architects like Sullivan and Root that were trying to turn the tide and have, a unique American architecture, but the majority of the architects at the time were wanting to do what was being done on the East Coast and, the neoclassical approach of just repeating the past over and over again. We sort of felt a similar feeling in past years of trying to get the Chicagoland marketplace more interested in modern architecture. But I think we're starting to finally see the tide shifting to more embrace of modernism, which is great. Young people that have the means to build a luxury home today are willing to take a chance that a house is going to shake things up a little bit in the neighborhood, even though it's not the safe route to go. So we're really enjoying to see the shift.
I get a lot of emails and calls, and one of the number one questions I get is, how do I choose an architect? They never call and say, how do I choose a builder? When I ask, have you thought about how you're going to choose a builder? And they go, oh, well, we'll just send out some bids to some people at the end, like it's just no big deal. And I have to stop them in their tracks and go, now, wait a second. Your problem is not picking the architect. There are a lot of good architects out there that can design anything you want. The problem is that a modernist house has different materials than traditional house often. It has different detailing. It requires different subs, often with different specialties. It's not the same thing. You just can't go ask your cousin Earl to bid on this because Earl is probably not going to do a good job, and you're going to be suing Earl a couple of years from now. Am I right about this, guys?
I would say so.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I tell people, in my personal opinion, whether it's with Newphire Building or a different company, that I feel it's of great benefit to select your team from the beginning, design the house with the architect, the builder, and the clients as a team, rather than the approach of designing the house all the way to construction documents and then bidding it out. Because builder can offer input as to what, is that really buildable?
Yeah.
I mean, like, how much is that going to cost? Where is the water-resistive barrier or the drainage plane in this assembly, that kind of thing. So
we think the same way, Kevin.
Yeah.
There's a misunderstanding, I think, for people that don't know about construction, that when you look at something that's modern, that it's simpler and less expensive to build because it's so clean. But as a company that builds modern knows, a construction company, that it's actually a lot more difficult to pull off that clean aesthetic because you've got no place to hide your mechanicals. Everything has to be executed really well, or you're going to see variations like where the walls meet the floor, or the walls meet the ceiling. It's all about the precision of the execution to make it look great, because I think even a layperson, if they see a really contemporary modern building that's built in in a mediocre fashion, I think you see that. It's all about how well it's executed.
So you're saying that some conventional building techniques let you hide errors?
Sure, like if you're covering everything up with moldings and there's a lot of soffitry and decorative elements, you're basically able to conceal a lot of the construction connections. And like, for instance, a pure modern house is typically not going to have a base shoe on the baseboard, and that's basically the piece of trim that hides the connection of the wall to the floor. If there's any sins and you just put a quarter round or a base shoe down, it's going to hide that. And then as those two surfaces expand and contract differently, you don't have a piece of molding to hide that seam. So like something like a flush baseboard, flush with the wall surface, and you may have like a nice small reveal. In order to achieve that, most builders that can build modern well know that you basically have to leave the drywall incomplete and build out a sequence to put the finished floor material in first. You've got to leave the bottom of the wall sort of unfinished, and then apply a baseboard that's perfectly scribed to the floor, and then complete the drywall with typically like an extruded aluminum reglet bead.
Okay, now you're talking jargon. You're going too far into the weeds here.
But he's so right.
But we get the idea.
And I'm getting the message here. This is why there's molding in all those boring houses in North Raleigh.
Right.
It's to hide the unsquare walls and floors.
Now, let's jump back a couple steps. So, Kevin, tell our listeners, what are some of the basic differences between, say, a stick-built developer house and a modernist house, either in terms of materials or technique or planning? Just some big pieces.
It really, frankly, depends architect to architect. But we deal with, and I shouldn't say deal, we enjoy working with a lot of great architects here. One of the things that we deal with is gigantic windows, and to the point where,
Gigantic meaning how big?
The largest that can be made in Europe.
Which is how big?
20
feet?
I can think of definitely, 10 by 12 foot triple pane, very heavy pieces of glazing, and trying to just manpower those in. We used to do that, and I don't even know how we used to do it. Now I've got a glass lifter to put those in. But getting back to the question, more very crisp lines, as Jake was alluding to, know where to hide any imperfections, trimless in a lot of cases, not all, but more and more so it seems. Basically wanting things to be as skinny as possible, like taking the rafters and ripping them down more thin than, I'm like, man, people need to get out there and clean the gutters.
Yeah, right.
Those are some of the things that come to mind.
Jake, what about you? What are some of the differences in materials or in the kind of subcontractor talent you need to build a modernist house well?
Well, I've seen that the savvy owners understand that it's important to put the team together on the ground level of selecting a contractor. You have to have a certain level of trust. Putting together the three-legged stool of the architect, owner, and general contractor, and sometimes, also an interior designer, from the very early schematic stages, and figuring out with contractor input for means and methods of how we're going to have these big, wide open, clean spaces, and how are we going to hide the structure? How are we going to hide the mechanical systems and the ductwork? And, how are we going to drain this roof? And often the modern houses we build have internal downspouts. How are we going to pipe that stuff from the roof past, the living space when it's wide open and there's very few walls? And, so getting feedback from the general contractor and the subcontractors on things like that are critical to the design before the design is figured out. So if you can get that good synergy of the structural engineer and the mechanical engineer and the different subcontractors to work through these things as the design is evolving, it's often the most successful project.
Jake brought up mechanical engineer, which would be fabulous if they're involved on every project, because way too often there's not enough thought that goes into, where's the return going to be? How are we going to get that gigantic duct that goes to the return from the mechanical room to the spot where the return is, and then wind up having to break the news to the homeowner that, we're going to take part of your closet or the pantry or, things like that. So it would be fabulous if mechanical engineer was involved regularly in any house, but particularly modern.
I know that a lot of people don't realize what's behind the walls of a house. In a typical developer house, for instance, if there's concrete, it's in the footings and the driveway. That's it. But a modernist house, concrete can be in a lot of different places, right, Kevin? Where can concrete be?
Well, we're working on one right now with a gigantic 38-foot tall, 2-foot wide board form concrete, and running right through the house, and just dealing with the challenges of moisture management with that is, something that is.
Is that a wall basically through the house?
It is.
Okay.
Yeah. It's presenting some unique challenges that we haven't faced before. Concrete, it does crack. So keeping water from going through the wall from the outside to the inside is a challenge, and you want to make sure to do it right.
And Jake, also in a modernist house, there's typically a lot of steel involved, someplace that isn't in a typical stick-built house. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so often the concrete and the steel structure, which if you're a builder can be beautiful before you actually build the rest of the walls and close everything up. And sometimes because so much engineering and effort goes into building the structure, it's almost a shame when it gets covered up. But, often when you see a cantilevered roof or some of the structural gymnastics that we have to go to pull off these modern buildings, you'd really have no idea of what is hidden behind the surfaces, once the house is completed.
Yeah, both the concrete and the steel, if you're coming from an energy efficiency perspective, present challenges on the thermal bridging and energy usage. So, when I'm coming at it, like how energy efficient can we make this building? And then there's a big concrete wall running right through the middle of it, or steel beams going inside to outside. That's where Passive House, for example, has a pre-construction review of plans, and they can provide input. But it's just not an expense that people are used to considering, because frankly, paying the architect and the builder is a lot of money.
Yeah, right.
Just in and of itself. So to have it energy model done is something that a lot of times is not in the budget.
Now, here's a question for both of you. Typically in the past, energy efficiency has been about the operational cost of a home once it's built. The lights, the water, the heat, gas, things like that. But now with climate change, a lot of people are looking at what goes into the house to begin with. So what's on the frontier of making our materials more climate friendly? I mean, are we going to be making houses out of pig poop soon? I mean, what's in the R&D channel about how to figure this out, guys?
Yeah, that's a good question. I had a friend's daughter is in college right now, and she wanted to know what I knew about building out of mushrooms. And I hadn't.
As opposed to building with while you're on mushrooms?
I'm not familiar with that one yet.
Yeah, we've been asked to, on some green projects, to use the mushroom-based rigid insulation.
Whoa.
Were you able to procure it?
Okay.
Which is, available, but not inexpensive. But I think that the important thing is there's a rising consciousness of what kind of carbon footprint is going into the various materials that we're using. The glass and the concrete and the steel. What is it taking to produce these? How many hours in the furnace is this tile? You know, like a porcelain tile takes up to like 24 hours to run through a furnace. And, you know, at least there's a thoughtfulness and a consciousness that people are starting to be aware of, so that you're trying to purchase materials that can come from more local sources instead of ordering stuff that's coming across an ocean to get to you, and how much energy it takes to produce something, and what are the alternatives.
Right. And on that first house I built, my first clients, they were very concerned with not only energy efficiency, but justice. And apparently there's a area in Louisiana called Cancer Alley where they make PVC, and just the chemicals involved with that process. And of course, it's people of color that are affected by this. And so they initially wanted me to use cast iron for all the waste pipes in the house, and we estimated that, and we went back to a green PVC, which is made out of recycled PVC, so that they could feel better about having it in their house. So, you know, energy efficiency, embodied energy, and then the justice of the impact that products have on communities.
There's a number of paving products, tiles, and cementitious products that are being made in such a way that they're supposed to absorb carbon dioxide after they're manufactured and installed, which is pretty innovative. I've also been hearing about photovoltaic glass that is transparent but is able to produce electricity.
Wow.
So instead of just having a solar panel on the roof, your glazing systems would actually become your photovoltaic panels.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So basically all your windows are producing power, right?
That's the idea, and it's a proven product. I just think it's going to take a while before it becomes more commonplace.
And I got to believe it's probably not megawatts it's producing, but something.
Something, yeah. Now, have either of you seen or played around with the 3D printed houses yet, where they squish out this concrete-like product like toothpaste out of the tube, and the robot goes around and just lays big rows of it, and 36 hours later, the walls are up? Have you seen that?
Seen the videos.
It's pretty impressive. You know, you see videos of that on YouTube and such. From an efficiency perspective, or building in a remote area, how quickly you can build something.
It seems like that it doesn't lend itself to much variation in design, because you can build a square, rectangular house pretty easily. But if you're going to get some different kinds of geometry, you know, you've got to have steel holding something up. That's a lot tougher to do in a 3D house.
Or a hyperbolic paraboloid?
Yeah, that's a little tougher to squeeze out your toothpaste tube.
Right.
Now, Jake, tell us about your work doing restorations, like when you've worked on a Mies building.
So we felt really fortunate to be not only building modern, but often being asked to do historic preservation on buildings that played a part in the development of modernism in Chicago, which my girlfriend introduced me to some clients that lived in John Root's home. And it's the building he designed and lived in and actually passed away in during the planning of the 1893 Columbian Exhibition. And he was one of the modernists with Sullivan that was trying to direct the team of architects to have the fair be, you know, a new American architecture. And he passed away from pneumonia in the house. I remember when I was reading Devil in the White City, I was reading the book at night in bed and hearing about the 1310 North Astor House. And then the next morning, I got called by my clients to check into a leak, a plumbing leak in the house. So the next morning, I had my head up in the ceiling between the joists looking at a rusted out cast iron stack that was 100 years old. And I just felt really lucky to be able to be working on, a house that was an important house historically to the modernism movement. And later in my career, we got the chance to restore Louis Sullivan's last commission, which was the Krauss Music Store. And as a kid, my dad always took me to the movies, and we would go to the Davis Theater on Lincoln Avenue across the street. And my dad would say, "Hey, that's Louis Sullivan's last building. He was an incredible Chicago modernist, and he died a penniless alcoholic." And then later, when I was dating my wife, I showed her the building, and a few years later, we got hired to do a full restoration of the facade. So I feel like our firm has been super lucky to not only build new modern, but to be trusted to do preservation on modern buildings that were the very early modernist creations in our city.
That's quite an honor.
It was a little intimidating, like on the Krauss Music Store, we had to take apart a lot of the terracotta on the front of the building and carefully each piece take it apart and inventory it and replace the rusted steel lintels and then put everything back. And we were able to do that without damaging any of the terracotta or needing to replace it. So it was pretty intimidating, but I just felt so lucky to be from a city with such a great legacy of, really where modernism was born, and to just play a part in being able to preserve some of these great buildings.
Now, I want to take both of you to some questions that I get a lot from people who are thinking about building a new modernist house. Mm-hmm. So let's say we've got a couple, and they've got a budget of X. They don't have an architect yet. They have a piece of property somewhere. It's going to be a new house. It's not going to be a renovation. They're kind of at square one, ready to go. So I know that you've seen clients, both of you, make a lot of rookie mistakes in their journey to get the house. So I'd like to hear your advice to our theoretical couple about what are the best decisions and things that they can make going forward. You want to start, Kevin?
Sure. George, I would say that I like to even get involved before they find the land if I can.
Okay.
And help them find land that will meet the needs, their stated goals for the house. And then, what I like to do is I like to try to direct them to some architects that we enjoy working with and we know will form a good team. So, if I can get land that works, direct them to, a couple of architects to talk to decide which one seems like the best fit for them. And then, as both Jake and I had stated, work together as a team with the builder, client, and architect to go through plan design. If all those things happen, there's not too many rookie mistakes to occur because they have someone guiding them through the process the whole way.
Jake?
I would think the number one thing is to not beat around the bush about what the budget is. Mm-hmm. Some people will sort of keep their cards close to the vest and they might throw out a number, but through the process of building the house, they expand the budget. And it really would have been in their best interest to provide a more accurate number on the front end because it would just be a lot more efficient for the architect and the contractor to maximize the outcome of what they ultimately were going to spend. And I think that there's so many disagreements, lawsuits, relationships ending in tatters because the architect or the general contractor was afraid to say, like, how much are you going to spend on this project just from day one? Right. Mm-hmm. And if the chemistry is there between the architect and the general contractor and the client, it should be a great synthesis of the three. The architect's keeping an eye on the contractor to make sure the building is getting built properly. But in the same way, the general contractor is keeping an eye on the design team and maybe the owners to make sure that they're sticking to the pre-agreed upon budget, because we often are tasked and try to do that well of keeping the team on budget. So like while the architect is doing the schematic design, we might say that's a really cool detail or cantilevered roof or something, but I don't think that we can afford to do that unless we adjust the budget. So we're kind of asked to be the police person to come through for the owner. And that's a challenge, is being resourceful to sort of find a common ground between the dreams of the architect and the budget of the owner. If you just think of the contractor as a commodity that you figure out later, I think you can run into some major misunderstandings.
I see a lot of couples who just play this game with both the architect and the builder, where, like you said, they don't reveal what their budget is. And because they don't reveal that, the architect in the beginning is kind of, hamstrung because they don't know what the real number is that they're working for. Uh-huh. Is it something that's going to float about depending on what's going on? Is there a real limit to it? I tell clients all the time, just pick a number, whatever it is, and just tell them what you want and let them work backwards. I mean, if you only have, say something low like $350,000 for a house, well, you might get a 400 square foot house, but, at least that's a starting point. I mean, you've got to really be honest with the people that are on your team. And the magic of working with an architect is they're trained to be able to use space differently than you know how to use space. Mm-hmm. Odds are you can't visualize it like an architect can. And the builders, they know what stuff costs. You're just going to be guessing at what things cost, and you're probably going to guess wrong. Is that about right?
Yeah, I'd say that's about right.
I think there's a fear that an owner has that if they reveal their budget mm-hmm. and somehow the contractor, the house was going to cost less, that they're just going to tell the owner that their budget at what it's going to cost because there's not like a basic level of trust there.
Yeah,
right.
I think it does come down to trust. You got to trust all the sides.
Yeah, and I've found that the biggest errors in budget occur when there isn't a builder involved. But there's also, some architects are much more in tune with current costs. And so as they're designing a house, they'll be getting feedback regularly and saying, what are current costs? How much is this going to be? And give positive feedback or accurate feedback to the clients about what it really might cost when we get the estimate done. And as long as people hear accurate information up front, it's less of a shock when they see that actual, detailed estimate.
I think that often architects, because they don't want to say they don't know, and because in order to get the job, they want to be able to appease the client by telling them what they want to hear about the budget. My dad used to say, I'm the architect, I don't build. So if you want to know what things cost, you should really talk to a contractor. Architects often, from an ego perspective, want to say that they know what everything costs and that they can design accordingly. But I think that bringing in the contractor is, you might as well face the music on the front end and get it out so that, everyone understands what they're trying to achieve in the beginning.
Mm-hmm. All right, gentlemen, here's my last question for the afternoon. HGTV. Has it made your lives better or more complicated?
Well, given that my wife watches it regularly, it is, the bane of my existence when I come home from work. And, we're going to do this in 3 days for $28,000. It's like, do they not have inspections in the town where this is occurring? It's like,
how long have you been married?
You had to ask. I think, let me guess about this, like 28 years, 27, 28 years.
Okay.
Pretty good run so far.
Because I know HGTV is very educational in terms of showing people what's involved, but they're compressing a whole lot into an hour, and I'm wondering if that's helping you guys out or just making things unrealistic for the clients.
I think in general, it can give the illusion that things happen faster and are less expensive than they really are. But I think, on the other hand, I think it exposes people to aspects of building that get them excited about what goes into making things, and maybe encourages them to want to get involved and build something cool.
Yeah.
Well, that's equivocal.
Yeah.
And they do occasionally like, wah, wah. Like termite damage, that's going to be another $10,000 to the budget. So they at least don't gloss over that sometimes.
Kevin, do you watch with your wife and point out what they're doing wrong on the show?
I kind of half-eye, glance over at it sometimes. And I try not to get too involved with it. But, as Jake said, maybe it inspires people to do things that they might not otherwise want to do. And I'm thankful to say that I don't do renovations. So, and Jake, your renovations sound like next level cool stuff. But I get a call about, will you add a bump out for a kitchen or something? I'm like, no, let me see if I can refer you to someone that is reputable and will do a good job. But that's not our wheelhouse,
I think there's other platforms today that are maybe more complex, like YouTubers who are construction-savvy companies and different engineering aspects, I think, that are not so simplistic to HGTV, that are good ways for people to get exposed to the complexities of building and modernism and engineering.
Jake and Kevin, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you for doing what you do so well, because we need to have people in the modernist universe who are very competent and very skilled and will not act like someone's cousin Earl who says, sure, I can do it.
Well, thanks for having us.
And bring in the crown molding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot for asking us to be part of this.
Los Angeles-based jazz vocalist James Torme has played the Greek Theater, Walt Disney Concert Hall, New York's Carnegie Hall, Birdland, London's Savoy, and a variety of classic venues all over the world. And he spent his childhood hanging out with folks like Ella Fitzgerald, Sammy Davis Jr., Peggy Lee, and Nat King Cole. And if James Torme's last name sounds familiar, perhaps you watched Night Court on TV back in the 80s when his famous dad, Mel Torme, a.k.a. the Velvet Fog, taunted Harry Anderson in at least 10 episode appearances. His debut album, Love for Sale, topped both the iTunes and Amazon jazz charts. So welcome to U.S. Modernist, James.
Thank you. What a pleasure to be here with you.
James, before we get started on the music, tell us about Night Court. I mean, that brought your dad, who was in his 60s at the time, a whole new generation of fans.
Oh, yeah. Night Court was a real blessing for my dad. He probably got as much of a career boost from that as anything else in that period of time. He was written onto the show, as you know.
Yeah.
As sort of a quirky, plot twist, so to speak. The judge, Harry Anderson, having the sort of fascination with him, sort of being iconic, almost like some people look at Sinatra.
Right.
Was he playing himself?
Yeah, he was.
He was playing himself. What was interesting about it is that out of that came a very genuine friendship between Harry and my father, and indeed the whole family. We ended up, we'd spend time over there with Harry and his wife, Leslie, and their little baby at the time, Dashiell, watching different things in his screening room. So, Harry didn't really know a lot in real life about my father, but he of course learned, by way of the show, and then became a big fan of Dad and his scat singing and his music and all of that. And so, the families became really tight out of that, which is kind of cool.
Did you get to go to any of those tapings for Night Court?
I don't think I went to any of those tapings. No. I was in the studio with my father quite a few times as a child, which was part of the inspiration, at least, for why I find myself in front of a microphone now. But I was in school in England at the time. I was educated, actually, I'm speaking to you from London right now. I was educated in boarding schools, almost Harry Potter style.
Oh, yeah.
So how'd you do with spells?
Yeah.
Well, that's the one course I think I may have failed.
The sorting hat didn't put him in the right class.
Right.
Yes. So we would go back and we would visit Dad at home in Beverly Hills 3 times a year, Christmas, Easter, and then summer vacation every year. And it was just magical because, with the limited time that we would have, we would just do a lot of really fun things. Dad would put his work aside in order for us to come in and visit. As much as he could, he would schedule his tours around when we were coming, over so that he could have time with us. But sometimes we would go out with him, on the road and also into the studio with him. So I remember I was just about to take my driving test. I was, I guess, just turned 16 maybe. This would be the late 80s, about 89. And my dad said to me, I'm going into Ocean Way Studios, very famous studio on Sunset Boulevard over in Los Angeles, this afternoon to record with the great Marty Paich. And, I think I was a little more interested in my Cap'n Crunch than going into the studio. But, when you're an adolescent, it's like, I had my driving test on my mind. I was just in another spot. But after rolling my eyes a little bit, I then went in with him. And, oh, my goodness, that changed my life, that experience. Just seeing the process. And, of course, it was the Marty Paich Dectet. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of that, but Marty Paich was an amazing arranger, really possibly the greatest West Coast innovative horn arranger. My dad and him made about 7 or 9 now historic vocal jazz albums and really changed the world of vocal jazz recordings from about 1954 until about 62 or 3. They had this album called Reunion, which they were making 30 years later, you know what I mean, in like 89. I went into the studio with him, and that was a big inspiration. So, all of those kind of things, tapings, played a role in inspiring my own sort of love affair with music.
And from that time, how long did it take you to decide, hey, I want to be a singer as well?
Well, I personally kind of had a feeling of providence, if you will, about singing from about the age of 10. I could sort of sing Michael Jackson songs, which of course was very relevant when you were in 1984.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And sort of uncannily, you know what I mean? I just realized that I could do that. And of course, I was exposed to so much music through, actually, to be fair, both my father and my mother's side. My mother's side of the family are also a lot of musicians and actresses and around the theater a lot. So we were lucky. We were exposed to a lot of great music on both sides of the Atlantic, my sister Daisy and I. And Dad took a great interest in sharing that world with us. And so I think I knew I was going to be something close to a singer, something involved with music, probably a singer, songwriter, that kind of thing at a very, very young age. And when it became really serious time where it's like you're telling your parents what you're actually going to do with your life.
Right.
You're out of college and they're like, what are you actually going to do?
I hate it
I
when they
remember
ask
that.
that.
Yeah.
My dad kind of like said, you really want to bang your head against a wall being a music artist? He said, son, you have to understand that I coined the phrase, absence makes the heart go wander. He, wasn't, I wouldn't say resistant to me following in somewhat in his footsteps in terms of just the profession. But he was full of warnings, if you will, caveats about it. He'd had, I was from his third of 4 marriages, my sister and I, between my 2 parents, I believe there were 7 marriages.
Wow.
So the show business will do that to you. You know what I mean? Real Brady Bunch type of thing. But I'm glad that I went into music, and a bit of acting as well, just because it is in my blood, and it's one of those things where if you're lucky enough to have the nature and the nurture growing up for that, You can only, and goes for anything that you have a natural predilection for. There's only so much you can run away from the essence of who you are. So I think I would have been very unhappy if I hadn't gone into at least something creative. But, I really turned pro, so to speak, not until my late 20s, really. I worked on other people's projects. I did some songwriting in my 20s, but I was in my very late 20s, early 30s by the time I actually started being an artist myself.
Well, James has been around long enough now to have classic tunes. So we're going to play one of those first. This legendary song was written in 1931 by Duke Ellington and Irvin Mills, and it's one of the top jazz standards, which has been recorded by too many artists to mention, but I can't help but mention Tony Bennett and Lady Gaga, Eva Cassidy, who we did a show about last year, and Cleo Lane, backed by our favorite band, Dr. Teeth and the Electric Mayhem on The Muppet Show. Here's James with It Don't Mean a Thing.
I remember a Russian melody that my grandmother used to sing. Every evening she'd start to sing for me this melodious Russian thing for me. Tanta baby la tanta lee, tanta tanta tanta. Dance my little one, keep on dancing, tanta dance for me. Tanta baby la tanta lee, tanta tanta tanta. Made me feel glad to be alive when I heard that Russian jive. It don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. Do-ah, 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 do-ah. It don't mean a thing, all you've got to do is swing. Do-ah, 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 do-ah. Makes no difference if it's sweet or hot. Give that rhythm everything you've got. It don't mean a thing, all you've got to do is swing. Do-ah, 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 do-ba-do-ba-ya. Hey, do-ba-do-dum-dee, do-dum-dee-do-ba, do-dum-da-do-da-do-dum-da-do. It don't mean a thing, all you've got to do is swing. Makes no difference if it's sweet or hot. Give that rhythm everything you've got. It don't mean a thing, all you've got to do is swing.
James, that was great. I did not know that your dad wrote the song Chestnuts Roasting on an Open Fire.
Oh, yeah.
It's actually called
The Christmas song?
Yeah.
I was just fascinated when I was doing the research for this to discover that.
People don't know about that, which is funny. For me, that's the song that put me through college. Something we're very proud of. And, it's just been a great blessing. It was the biggest hit, of course, for Nat Cole that he ever had.
Mm-hmm.
The first Christmas song to be introduced to us all, by an African American, another distinction I know that my father was proud of. It was written in the very hot summer of 1945, released in 46. It was pretty much an attempt to cool down in an unseasonably hot summer that they had in Los Angeles in 45. And by the way, co-written with my dad's longtime songwriting partner, a guy called Bob Wells.
I've heard of Bob Wells. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So my dad went over to Toluca Lake, which is in the San Fernando Valley, not far from where I live most of the time in Sherman Oaks there in Southern California.
Bob Hope's area. Yeah.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And my dad went over, as was his custom, to write for the day with Bob. And this is the pre-air conditioning days and also the pre-Manson family days where everyone left their doors open. So my dad just walked in. He walked into the foyer there, and Bob Wells had this piano set up in sort of his main foyer, atrium, whatever you call it. But he was nowhere to be seen. And my dad sort of glanced over and he saw that there were 4 lines scribbled down on a spiral, one of those spiral pads?
Yeah.
In pencil. And it was the first 4 lines of the song. Chestnuts roasting on an open fire, Jack Frost nipping at your nose, Yuletide carols being sung by a choir, and folks dressed up like Eskimos. And eventually Bob Wells sort of appeared from one of the doorways, and my dad said, "Hey, Bob, put a towel on." No, that's not what happened. What actually happened was he said, he's like, "Where have you been? And second of all, what is this?" And he said, "Mel, I have to tell you, I was so overheated today that all this morning before you got here, I've been trying to cool down. I've been drinking cold water. I jumped in my pool. I've tried a cold shower, and I was just, you know what I mean? Nothing but hot, consumed with the heat today. It's just oppressive." And I thought, said Bob, and I thought that if I could somehow write some kind of wintry verse, just a few lines of wintry verses, having tried every other thing, maybe I can just attack this thing mentally, you know what I mean? And I can just cool myself down psychosomatically. And my dad kind of just looked at him like, "What?" And then looked back at the 4 lines and said, "You know what, though? I think there's something here. There might be something here." And I'm not kidding. About 28 minutes later, that song was completed. A lot of songs I know as a songwriter myself that are the best songs, just sort of, they're about the people themselves getting out of the way and just letting the song come through. And sometimes they're written very quickly, some of the best songs, And so the song just sort of, quote unquote, wrote itself. And about a half an hour later, they're just sitting there with this song that they constructed sort of out of thin air. I don't think Bob Wells was any cooler. But they looked at each other and sort of said, "You know what? Let's drive this over the hill." And it's interesting. They got into my dad's 1947 MGTC, which him and Nat Cole and Buddy Rich, I believe, all bought the identical cars back in the 2 or 3 years earlier. And they drove it over to Van Heusen Publishing first. And this is a part of the story that even people who tell the story and think they know it, they don't know this detail. So I'm doing this exclusively for Modernist radio here.
Thank you.
Thanks.
But they went up into the offices there, you know what I mean, in the publishing house, and played the song there. And they were like, "This song is useless." They're like, this song is really... And my dad's like, "What do you mean? We really like it." And he was like, "No, this thing it's only good for 1 day of the year." It's literally what they said. So they left there, perhaps slightly discouraged, and went to what was always meant to be their primary destination, which was over to Hancock Park on the other side of town, to the home of a dear friend of my dad's, a guy called Nat Cole. And they played the song for Nat. Actually, they played it once, and Nat goes, "Play that again." And they played it again, and before they could get to the end of the second time, he goes, "Stop! That's my song. That's my song. Nobody else." And my dad, bless him, in an act, I think, of wonderful altruism and selflessness, said, "You know what? It's yours," and handed it right to Nat. And Nat recorded it, I want to say a few months later that year. 2 different versions. Another thing that most people don't know. The first version that he actually recorded, he says reindeers. And then when he learned that that wasn't grammatically correct, he insisted on re-recording it. So if you ever hear the version where he says reindeers, that's very rare. You don't hear that so much, but it does exist, and you can sometimes hear it on the radio. But you know, it was 1946, and what do we know about that year? Well, that was the year that so many GIs were returning from World War II. And so I think for sure that one of the great reasons for the song, catching on so brilliantly was the fact that it was sort of the first Christmas back home for American soldiers, so many of them. And so for the rest of their lives, they associated that song with this feeling of being back, being back home, and that sort of glow of having that first Christmas back home after the Battle of the Bulge or Iwo Jima or wherever they'd been, for the previous 4 years or so. So the rest is, I guess, our financial pleasure. No, the rest is history, you know what I mean? And it's just, been a total blessing. As I said, I think it's the number 10 song of all time, the last time that was checked.
And for that generation, it was the equivalent of All I Want for Christmas Is You, which has, been big the last 25 years.
Right,
but,
that's true. That's actually true. My dad used to say, "I'm very happy with the Christmas song, but it's not my favorite Christmas song," he would say. His favorite was also pretty much my favorite, which is Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas.
Yes.
By Judy Garland and Meet Me in St. Louis. But no, a great blessing and kind of an unlikely birth that it had on that hot day out in Toluca Lake.
Well, this song of James comes from his latest album. Its source is a very weird 1970 Barbra Streisand film, On a Clear Day You Can See Forever. If you can get past the plot, which concerns a reincarnated woman with ESP dealing with her French psychiatrist, the music is just delightful. Written by Lerner and Lowe, here's James with Come Back to Me.
Hear my voice where you are. Take a train, steal a car, hop a freight, grab a star, come back to me. Catch a plane, catch a breeze, on your hands, on your knees, swim or fly, only please come back to me. On a mule, in a jet, put yourself in a net, but come back to me yet. I don't care, this is where you should be. From the hills to the shore, ride the wind to my door, turn the highways to dust, break the law if you must, move the world only just come back to me. Blast your hide, hear me call, must I fight City Hall? Here and now, darn it all, come back to me. What on earth must I do? Scream and yell till I'm blue. Curse your soul, when will you come back to me? Have you gone to the moon or a corner saloon down in darkest Peru? I don't care, this is where you should be. In a crate, in a trunk, on a horse, on a trunk, in a Rolls or a van, wrap yourself in saran. Any way that you can, come back to me, come back to me, come back to me.
Did Barbara sing that in the movie?
I don't know that part of the history of the song.
The Wrap Yourself in Saran really caught my ear.
Oh, it's great. There are a few different versions of the lyrics too, guys, that have been done. And I actually sometimes would mess around with the lyrics a little bit, which is sort of a habit my dad had too, just to make a little couple changes to make it even more unique. I'm sure the original songwriter is like rolling in their grave when you do that. But
you did a great job. That was fantastic.
This Just In, Come Back to Me, was sung by Yves Montand and was first performed by Louis Jordan.
Oh, I see. Yeah. I was going to say, I thought that the history was a little different on that. And I guess Barbra Streisand came along later, or that film. But the way I know it is from the 1962 or so Peggy Lee version. And that, in fact, that arrangement is by a friend of mine who's now getting on a bit. He's in his probably 90s, maybe even, a guy called Bill Holman, wonderful West Coast arranger who I had the pleasure of meeting a few years ago. That version, which we did, which is very much lifted from the Peggy Lee 60s version, by John DeVersa, who is an incredible producer. He was the lead producer on Love for Sale, the album whence that particular track came. And I remember it was the first one I recorded on that album. So it was kind of an icebreaker, if you will. I was like, getting warmed up into the album. I recorded the song one time without John, I remember, because I was just like, I'm just going to record it. And then he came in and heard it. He says, well, that's more of a demo. And so he made me do the whole song again. I remember that. It taught me that, when you think you've got to the peak of what you're doing, you can actually usually better it again just by digging in even more type of thing. And, interestingly, I mentioned Marty Page, the great arranger.
Yeah.
Him and his son, David Page, who's an 8-time Grammy winner himself, who's one of the founding members of Toto.
That's where I know him. Yep.
David was the supervising producer on this album. So we keep the generations going. You know what I mean? The families are still together after all these years making jazz music. Speaking of family continuance, keeping the family generations together, you mentioned Cleo Lane earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, Cleo Lane, I remember being around her as a child because her and my dad used to do shows together. He'd come over and do like the Royal Festival Hall or the Barbican or whatever with Cleo. And I'm really tight with her granddaughter, Emily Dankworth, because, she was married to Johnny Dankworth, British jazz player.
Yeah.
And then her dad, Cleo's son, Alec Dankworth, he's a wonderful jazz bassist, and he's played with me out here in the UK before when I've come out here on tour. So it's kind of cool when you keep these connections together. You see that one of the other families of somebody that was working with your father a lot, that they're still in the business and super talented. Again, a lot of genes going down there, plus a lot of exposure to what we would call the right music.
Right.
You know what I mean? And so it's cool. We try to continue that as much as we can.
Now, James, we didn't fail to notice that on your website, jamestorme.com, you are lying on a mid-century modern couch.
That's right.
Next to a mid-century modern coffee table.
That's right.
So thank you for doing that,
Yeah. You wanted me to tell you a little more about that? Because that's kind of got a little story behind it that I think will be especially relevant and may never be relevant on another radio show like it is on your show. That I wanted to do very much a mid-century vibe, and I created that. So I brought over an old record player to my wonderful friend Nora, who is a fantastic photographer, Nora Schaefer, who's a great photographer out in Hollywood, up in the Hollywood Hills there. You can see the Hollywood sign is like massive from her house up there. And the house is very much in the, like you guys talk about, the Sinatra sort of Palm Springs type of modern design.
Yeah.
It has like a huge, a lot of glass walls and all that. So it's excellent for photography. And I've done many shoots there, over the years. I do most of my, if I need to do a shoot, I go there. But it's empty. So her and her boyfriend have been living there for years, and there's a little bit of furniture, weird, 60s, almost like Kubrick style furniture there, but not quite that mid-century vibe that I wanted for this particular shoot. So I showed up with all these props, and she's like, "You are so funny. You show up with all these props." and I brought obviously I dressed the way that I am in that photo, but I had the Bang & Olufsen 1959 turntable and all of those LPs, and sort of set up my own scene in there, almost like a
Great staging.
I was my own staging person that day. And so I'm glad that you enjoyed the results of that.
Well, James, this has been so fun talking to you. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, man, what a privilege. I hope we'll do it again sometime. Great show. Love your guys' show.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs, and by Modernist realtor Angela Roll. Okay, Tom, take us out.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 15,000 significant modernist houses, and access 4 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song is performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Kelly Policelli did guest research this week, while rogue archivist Carrie Cesarino emerged from her office to work on one of our house tours. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I will be back soon with another It's Not the Architect, It's the Builder
It's the Builder
edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.